everyone. I'm Ed O'Keefe in for Elaine Quijano tonight. Thanks for joining us. Great to be with you. Uncertainty about Omicron, the newest coronavirus variant, is fueling uncertainty in the markets about how it might further disrupt already disrupted supply chains. Then, of course, there's persistent inflation. And scientists are working to gain a better understanding of the Omicron variant as Republicans say it illustrates the administration's failed COVID response. For months, the Biden administration has pulled strongly on the question of handling the pandemic. But as Americans grow increasingly tired of pandemic life and the number of unvaccinated Americans remains stubbornly stagnant, it's unclear if the president can sustain strong support for his pandemic response. There are also new developments tonight in the investigation of the deadly January 6th insurrection. The House Select Committee investigating it confirms that former Trump Chief of Staff Mark Meadows has agreed to provide documents related to what happened that day and to appear for an interview. The news comes on the same day the former president deploys his latest legal maneuver, attempting to keep secret his activities related to January 6th. Mr. Trump is asking an appeals court here in Washington to overturn a lower court's ruling that said the National Archives could turn over the records related to the former president to Congress. Meanwhile, Congress is facing a long to-do list. First, lawmakers need to avoid a government shutdown by midnight Friday. Seems we may see some movement on that the next day or so. Then there's the fight over the debt limit and when exactly it needs to be raised. Congress also needs to sort out passage of the annual defense policy bill. And then, of course, there's the president's Build Back Better plan. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell addressed his party's stance on a Biden spending package and raising the debt ceiling.
Most of us feel that the single best thing we could do to fight inflation right now would be to kill this bill. And only one Democrat could do that. Are we hopeful that one will step forward? Absolutely.
Are you confident that the government won't shut down by the end of the week?
Yeah, we won't shut down.
Remember that he says we won't shut down. Despite the opposition of Republicans and one key Democrat, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer still seems optimistic about getting the president's social and climate spending plan passed by the end of the year.
We're going to get this bill done with 50 Democrats before Christmas. That's our goal.
Before Christmas. Circle your calendars and cancel your plans, folks. For more, let's bring in Skyler Henry, Siobhan, Hughes, and Jim Tankersley. Skyler covers the White House and Congress for CBS News. He's a busy guy. Siobhan is a congressional reporter for the Wall Street Journal. We used to scrum together there in the halls of Congress. And Jim, of course, is a White House correspondent for the New York Times and with a specialty in economic policy. And Jim, let's begin with you. Republicans are now trying to tie inflation to the debate over whether or how to raise the debt ceiling. Is that a fair argument to make? Are the two issues actually that intertwined?
No, not at all right now. I mean, remember that the debt ceiling is not about raising it right now to fund new spending bills proposed by the president. This is about just funding the current amount of spending that the government is on the books to do, making good on our obligations. There are no economists who are saying that lifting the debt limit is going to make inflation worse. And so it is a very different argument, obviously, than we've heard in previous debt ceiling fights. And there's a reason why we didn't hear it before. It's because it's really not very, very pertinent.
And despite a dramatic decline in the unemployment rate, Jim, inflation and supply chain issues, of course, persist. So how might this new COVID variant impact the economic outlook? Has the Biden administration figured that out? Have any other economic groups tried to do the numbers yet?
Well, the administration is still running the numbers. The press secretary, Jen Psaki, told us yesterday that they do not have any new forecasts to share. But the Fed chair, Jay Powell, did sort of warn Congress today that obviously this could really impact supply chains, could further exacerbate the problems that we're seeing there. And, overall, you have to worry about both growth and inflation from a variety of angles with a new variant. If the job market stops hiring, if people feel afraid to go back to work, or if consumers feel afraid to go and spend money in restaurants and travel, and instead stay home and spend more on the goods, the furniture, and other things that everybody's buying online right now, that could further worsen the supply chain crisis, push up prices even more for goods, and potentially hurt inflation.
Skyler, you're at the congressional end of Pennsylvania Avenue, but up the street at the White House. Do we have any updates on what they're planning to do to deal with Omicron beyond travel restrictions and encouraging vaccinations?
Well, Ed, up to this point, it feels as though they are letting the science kind of lead the way, if you will, in terms of them trying to make any sort of move in terms of restrictions or mandates or any sort of new recommendations. We heard from White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki, who essentially said that the president yesterday kind of hinted towards what he would be talking about later this week in terms of a detailed strategy to try to deal with Omicron. But he did say this: there will be no shutdowns, there will be no lockdowns, instead trying to working on ways to try to expand vaccinations and then also encouraging more people to sign up to actually get vaccinated if they haven't already done so. And for those who have, to go ahead and do what they need to do to try to get their booster shot sooner rather than later. But I think many within the administration have already said that they are waiting for the next few days and weeks to see what may come from this variant in terms of what scientists figure out, how transmissible it is, how dangerous it is, before they take any additional steps.
I think we'd all agree it's going to be fascinating to watch this White House fill the time between now and when the scientists finally give us a sense of what exactly Omicron is and how bad it could be. Because you mentioned that speech he's giving on Thursday at NIH. What else are they going to do as we await information? It's going to be fascinating to watch. Siobhan, here in Washington today, we learned that the former Trump chief of staff, Mark Meadows, is now cooperating with the House committee investigating the January 6th attack on the Capitol. What do we know about the deal?
Well, we know that Mark Meadows had initially resisted responding to that subpoena to provide either documents or appear for a deposition. What we know now from the chairman of that committee is that Mr. Meadows has agreed to come in for what they are calling an initial deposition, a date not yet set, and also that he has started producing some records. This does not appear to be, though, a global, universal, comprehensive agreement. It's worth noting that Mr. Meadows' lawyer sent out a statement saying that we appreciate the Select Committee's openness to receiving information on a voluntary basis on what they are calling non-privileged topics, so topics that they feel would be outside of the scope of Mark Meadows' role as White House Chief of Staff. So this does appear to be a limited deal. It buys some time to avoid things coming to a head, in which the committee had threatened to hold Mr. Meadows in contempt and then, of course, potentially refer him to the Justice Department on criminal charges akin to what has already happened to Steve Bannon.
I just want to pass along one little bit of reporting from our colleague Ellis Kim here at CBS, who says that she actually ran into Georgia's Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, outside one of the House buildings a little while ago, and apparently he was in town today to talk to the January 6th committee. He says that they had reached out to him, and among other things, they discussed the 2020 election and post-election issues. So that's interesting that they're now reaching down to Atlanta to seek information about what went on. And Siobhan, remind us, what is the sort of general progress of the investigation so far, beyond cutting deals with these key players?
Well, there have been dozens of subpoenas that have been issued. We know that there were 3 people who were problematic for the committee: Mr. Meadows, Mr. Bannon, and a DOJ official named Jeffrey Clark, who in fact is going to be at the center tomorrow when that select committee may vote to try to hold him in contempt. But of the dozens of other subpoenas, there has not been a peep, and from which you can intuit that those folks are cooperating with the committee. And on top of that, there are hundreds of other people who have agreed to cooperate on a voluntary basis. It does sound like Brad Raffensperger is one of those people. And it's interesting because, of course, he was somebody who was on the phone with Mark Meadows and President Trump during that infamous phone call in which Mr. Trump was pressuring him to come up with more votes to produce a Trump victory.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. He's definitely an important player in all this, at least in the post-election aftermath. Jim, switching back to other business that Congress has to do, of course, the big issue that faces them eventually is passage of the Biden spending plan, or what they like to call it, the White House, the Build Back Better plan. Today, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer said he wants it passed by Christmas, and that the White House also endorsed that timetable. I think Jen Psaki did as they were flying to Minnesota this afternoon. Are they being overly optimistic?
I mean, my bet, as someone who has covered, like you have had so many of these bills in the past, is that they're always being optimistic when they say they can do it by Christmas. But in this case, they certainly have some urgency behind them. They definitely want to get to end the year, just like Republicans did in 2017 with President Trump's tax cuts. They want to end the year on a high note legislatively. And there's just this worry among Democrats that the longer that they let this go without being done and being passed and on the president's desk, the more they risk just never getting it done, because a senator like Joe Manchin of West Virginia might just decide that, hey, this is just the wrong time to do a big bill like this. So I think that's the urgency driving them. There's also my colleague, Emily Cochran, who covers the Hill for us, was telling me today there's also an increased sense of urgency on the child tax credit, which, the expanded credit would expire at the end of this year. They'd like to extend it for another year in that bill. And so I think there's a real push by Democrats that, hey, we don't want to stop the payments from that tax credit by going into next year on this.
That would seem to be enough urgency, you would think, to get this done. That's a good point. Skyler, as we mentioned, the president is in Minnesota to tout the infrastructure bill that he signed into law a couple of weeks ago. What do we know about why they chose to go to the land of 10,000 lakes and what it might say about what the White House is thinking about next year's midterms?
Well, it's pretty on the nose, right? The president is making a stop in Rosemount. That's the 2nd congressional district in Minnesota, also repped by Democrat Congresswoman Angie Craig. And when you take into consideration just how tight the races will be as we head into next year and how important these seats are, especially for Democrats, that sort of thing is very important when you take into consideration that the Republican challenger in that race went against Representative Craig in 2020 and plans to do so in 2022. And so I think you'll start to see the president make even more stops in these battleground districts, battleground states across the country. Wouldn't be surprised if he has stops along the way in Ohio, Pennsylvania, obviously some high Senate races to watch out for there. We saw Dr. Oz announce that he was running for senator in Pennsylvania. So I think we'll start to see the president start to tout what he's done in terms of the bipartisan infrastructure package, also try to hang his hat on the Build Back Better Act if and when that passes, and then look to see what other things he can try to champion as he makes his way across the country and tout his record as he tries to maintain Democratic control here in Washington.
The president, Skyler, is also keeping an eye on the holiday shopping season. He met with CEOs of major retailers on Monday. What more do we know about how that meeting went?
Well, it was essentially a gumbo of economic issues. You take into consideration inflation and their concerns. If you talk about what that does in terms of making sure store shelves are properly stocked in terms of supply chain concerns that we've been seeing, and then also making sure that things are affordable for everyday consumers as we get ready to, or as we kicked off into this holiday shopping season. And so we met with these CEOs to talk about all of those things, essentially trying to make sure that these supply chain issues are being addressed through that bipartisan infrastructure package, but also making sure that it is actually safe for workers because of, as you all mentioned, the Omicron variant of the coronavirus, and trying to make sure workers are vaccinated while they are in there doing their thing. And so I think that is something that we are going to hear more from the president. He's planning on addressing that a little bit more tomorrow in terms of the state of the economy and also what's being done to try to address some of that logjam and bottleneck in terms of those supply chains. But I think the president is just looking to kind of keep the momentum going, trying to make sure that the dollars and cents are making sense in terms of addressing some of these economic concerns, particularly with inflation. We've talked about Build Back Better. Congressional Democrats feel as though that will actually address some of those inflation concerns, passing that bill. I think it'll be interesting to see, as you all were talking about, just how quickly they are able to not only get that to the floor, but if they are able to keep all the Democrats in line and try to get that bill passed.
You mentioned a gumbo of economic issues, and now I'm hungry. But you're right. I mean, it's one of the big things he's got to worry about here as Christmas approaches. Siobhan, one other thing they're worrying about there on Capitol Hill is this. Senate Democrats today complained about the ongoing logjam of the president's nominees for a variety of roles across the federal government. Give us a sense of who's being held up at this point and why, and whether they might actually be able to get some of these guys confirmed by the end of the year.
Well, there's not a single factor driving this, but there are a couple of personalities. For example, Ted Cruz. He is very upset that President Biden did not impose sanctions over the Nord Stream pipeline, which provides gas from Russia to Germany. And so he has stepped in to hold up some Treasury Department nominees. Josh Hawley waging a protest against State Department nominees over the messy withdrawal from Afghanistan. You also have a bunch of banking regulators who are the subject of a lot of Republican opposition and maybe a little bit of Democratic opposition, too. But of course, all of that eats up time. And that is time that Chuck Schumer does not want to devote right now, given everything else on his plate, including that Build Back Better bill. You'd asked about timing. As far as timing, what this does mean is that we could be in for a lot of late nights and a lot of weekend work in December, and not exclusively because of the desire to complete that big part of President Biden's agenda.
Well, when you're up there covering those late nights, you find Skyler, and he's going to provide the gumbo. That much we know.
I'll hold you to that.
Skyler Henry at the Capitol, Siobhan Hughes, Jim Tankersley, thank you all for starting us off tonight.